If you want to keep up with our vlog discussions, please hit that subscribe button. And now let's get to our discussion topic of the week. We're talking about balancing what your deck does, aka the theme of the deck, with all of those utility cards. I'm talking your ramp, I'm talking your card draw, I'm talking your removal. We brew a lot of decks, and I come up against this all the time. I want to go default with my ramp cards. I want to go default with my draw cards and my removal, my wrath cards and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, all of those spots, that takes up a lot of spots. That takes up, what, 15, 20, depending how your meta is, depending how aggressive and how, like, interactive you want to make it. And that doesn't, you take away 40 cards for lanes, you take away 20 cards for those. That leaves less than half the deck that is actually the spirit of the deck, what the deck wants to do. So I want to take a moment, and with this discussion topic, let's just talk about ways to get that synergy up, right? How to balance what your deck does with those utility cards.
Yeah, this is also where you get the idea of like staples, I think, for the most part, right? There are staples of each like type of deck as well, but when we're talking about staples for the most part, we're talking about the cards that, the things that draw you cards, the things that ramp you, the things that every deck needs. So in a way, we're kind of discussing, we're also going to be sort of touching on staples a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, and maybe the definition of staples, like whether or not, like, is it the best to always use the quote-unquote staple of that, or is it better for you to go a little outside of that?
Right.
Just take a look at it. Great. I think the first thing to mention might be that the only time you wouldn't need this is if your deck isn't very synergistic. If your deck is just mostly good stuff and you want the best of the things, I think in that case it probably does make sense to just go with the tried and true staples of our format, because they're staples because of their efficiency. They don't do a lot of extra stuff, they just do what they do very well.
Yeah, you'll get the most for your mana investment there, and it'll have these will have the biggest impact on the table or on your like card advantage and things like that, right? Like talking about something like Kadama's Reach over something like Traveler's Amulet, for example. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, so I think it's important to identify then, like, what does your deck want to do, right? And so generally we sort of have deck categories. And I think an easy one that comes up a lot is like token strategies, right? A lot of decks are tokens and a lot of them use green. And I think it's important then, like, there's lots of other ramp cards. I'm not going to quote the examples. We haven't like dug deep on all these examples, but just think about, there are ramp cards that bring tokens along with them. The one I'm thinking of off the top of my head brings like an Eldrazi spawn with it while you kind of ramp. So that's a token creature, and it also like ramps your mana that way.
Yeah. So you're looking again. It's balancing the synergy of your deck or your commander, if you like, with the stuff that is going to do the job the best. And I think that for the most part, the fun of commander is finding those cards that will synergistically work with your deck strategy or your commander, and getting the job done at the same time. That's where you find little incremental value that you kind of trade. Sometimes you trade off that efficiency for. As we talked about this before, certainly when it comes to efficiency in commander. But trading off that for actually added value is usually pretty nice.
Yeah, one that I'd love to highlight, I mean, I'm just springing this on you. I know we're not going to list like tons of cards, but one that I always think about in this regard is Tragic Slip. Tragic Slip is a fantastic removal spell. It's a single black mana, and it's instant, and it either gives a creature -1/-1, or it gives a creature -13/-13. And if you have any sort of deck that can control sacrificing creatures, maybe you're a token strategy, like if that's already part of your strategy, I'm definitely going to go with Tragic Slip, as opposed to maybe like a Murderous Cut, which is a little bit more of a standard staple in a black deck.
Yeah, Murderous Cut is going to be able to delve and get you some real good efficiency there, but it doesn't obviously hit. I mean, each card has its trade-offs, obviously, right? Like,
it's true.
Murderous Cut can't kill an Avacyn, Tragic Slip can.
Yeah. Murderous Cut can't kill a gigantic Hamlet back Goliath.
Right.
Or no, vice versa. Tragic Slip can't.
Yeah.
But Murderous Cut can. Again, Tragic Slip can get a god off the table if it's a creature.
True, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, we could go on and on, but like every card has pros and cons, but just we'll encourage you to take a moment to identify what your deck does and try to adjust those staples. Like, look at your removal spells and see if you can't upgrade it, quote unquote, to one that kind of is more synergistic and on theme.
Yeah, like one that I always find myself running is it's a Wrath.
Yeah,
and
Wraths are great. Wraths are great for this. There's so many to choose from.
There are so many, right? And we talked about this actually quite a bit on the last discussion topic. But one that I will often bring up is Kirtar's Wrath, which is a 6-mana Wrath spell, so 4 and double white. It destroys all creatures. They can't be regenerated, which doesn't come up super often in Commander, but can be relevant. It has threshold, so if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you randomly get 2 1/1 spear creature tokens. Well, like, that doesn't seem like much, but again, in a token deck, like, all of a sudden you're started off, like, you've got a little start there for the next build up of your board, or if you care about sacrificing things, that's already 2 sack things you have, or whatever, right? Like, there could be a number of reasons why you would want to have 2 1/1 flyers, which is great, right? Like, these are 2 little evasive creatures. It's pretty nice. So running this over like one of the 5-mana board wipes, or even one of the 4-mana ones, I think in a lot of decks makes a lot of sense. And you give up that little bit of efficiency, so you take a staple out where you put in and you add a little more value and synergy there.
Kirtar's Wrath, cool. I hadn't, that one was not in my radar. Like, I had totally forgotten about that one entirely.
I think it's been very rare that I even cast this with Threshold, because I just put this in like a token deck or something else. Like, it actually, I'm not usually stocked up in my graveyard in the decks that I do run this in, but you don't have to, because that will just happen sometimes. Or if you do want to make it super synergistic, then you can make sure you get those 2 tokens every time. But it's a pretty small bit of value, but it's there at least, right? So yeah, in this case, this is one that I run over those more efficient cards. Now, the other thing, again, we've talked a little bit about on this discussion topic before, is like when it comes down to whether, if you're making a good stuff deck, you just throw all the best stuff in there no matter what. If you're making a deck where you're eyeing synergy and you're eyeing those interactions, then sometimes you still will want that really good the best version of the card. Like, you want your Wrath of God or whatever, but other factors will then come in and start to look at being tiebreakers. And of course, on this podcast, we talked enough about price of the actual card, like the dollar value of the card. That will be a big factor for some people. If again, talk about it again as well, but if you're in a more competitive meta and it's a more spiky meta, then yeah, those efficiency points are going to matter to you. So that's what's going to come down and break the tie sometimes. Or just even sometimes availability can be a thing. You might this one particular card might be sold out everywhere, and you might even try and find it online, and it's tough to come by. That happens with some of the older cards, obviously, any kind of reserve list stuff. I mean, but then you're also probably talking price as well. But that can be a factor sometimes as well. So those are other reasons why you might switch over to a more synergistic card that you're making other trade-offs for.
Yeah, another realm where like this is very important. It's so interesting if you're running blue, because everyone's like, well, then if blue gets its own staple category of counter spells, right? Like, every blue deck should run a couple of counter spells, but we don't say that of other colored decks. We don't say like every red deck should run the counter spell that red has.
Yeah.
But the neat thing about that too is blue has so many counter spells that, again, you get to be selective with what you do. Like and just like you said, if I'm running more than one, sure, I'll probably run the classic counterspell, right? The classic one. And even then, you can make an argument that that might not be the best one for your deck if you're not heavy blue. That maybe the double blue is a little trickier than you would like. But man, so many counterspells bring tokens along with them in the form of clues or treasure tokens. Some of them will exile versus just get in the graveyard, which is important. And there's even a few that don't technically counter spells. They just put spells back on the deck or put spells somewhere else so that things that can't be countered, they're not technically being countered, so you get around those. Some of that discussion is meta dependent. Obviously, looking out on what you're going to be up against is a big difference, but I think looking in about what your deck is always a guarantee. I don't know if putting a spell on the top of the deck ever matters in our meta. I can think of very few times where I wish I could have done that, but if I know that the one that comes to mind is the proliferate counter spell. If I'm running a Traxa or any deck with a lot of +1/+1 counters, maybe a Simic one, let's run the one that lets you proliferate. You know, you're paying for
fuel for the cause.
Fuel for the cause, right? So maybe you don't. It costs you 4. 2 blue, so that's more than the average rate for a counterspell, but being able to proliferate could be way more valuable in a pinch.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's going to be something you're going to include Traxa decks of your charge counters. Obviously, you know, if you're heavy any kind of counter, you're going to take a look at Fuel for the Cause at the very least, and you'll make that decision. And I've definitely done it where I will almost always choose the synergy over something that's super efficient. I just will, just because it's maybe it's just my play style. It seems more fun. It seems more like, aha, look at this, though. I also can do a spell and I get some things. Like, that's always feels to me way better than simply countering a thing. It's probably not a whole lot better, but it is a bit better for sure. Talking about deck construction. So we talked about some cards types, you know, your counters, ramps, things like that. But if you're talking about like deck construction, good stuff deck obviously is its own thing. But if we are talking about a deck where we want to build around, say, a commander's ability, a synergistic style, so if it's something like counters, like we're talking about here for Fuel for the Cause, what do you think is the optimum number? Like is there an optimum number? Does that even exist for like good efficient cards over these types of sort of value added cards a little bit? Like, do you think that you throw in a counter spell, you throw in a Wrath of God, and you throw in this one, and then those three, like, okay, those ones are top priority, those ones are like top efficiency, the best ones, and now I have room for my other ones? Or do you just have it be a mix? Like, how do you usually approach it?
So my approach is I start with the deck's heart itself. I don't think about counter spells. I don't think about draw. I don't think about ramp first. I think about what is the fun part of my deck. What's my deck doing? It's all about reanimation. Then I'm going to do all of that stuff, right? I'm going to start with my commander, start with cool synergies there. And then once I'm at the cut down phase, like once I'm like, okay, I got my first draft, I have about 130 cards here.
Jeez,
so I got to do some cuts. That's a lot. Some of those first cuts are very easy.
Yeah.
That's when I'll add in, like, I'll specifically look for some, I probably want to do 2 Wraths. I probably want a small handful of draw cards. And again, it so depends on the deck and what colors you have access to. I love it if I can get cards that double up on some of these things. It's so useful because that's one extra slot. Ideally, I want as few spots as possible dedicated to just doing the thing with no other benefit.
Right.
Ideally, 0. Right? Ideally, every card synergizes in some way. That's unrealistic in all the color combinations for all the things we're going to do, but that's where I'm starting from. I want as few as possible that don't synergize.
Yeah, I think you're right in that, like, you want as few as possible that don't synergize, but at the same time, that's pretty unrealistic. Like, I know that if you listen to Command Zone, I know Josh is a big proponent of 10 ramp, 10 draw. And then you can find room for whatever else you need. And then in that, you can also find some synergy, right? Like there are synergistic spots in those. Those aren't just like 10 things you have to fill up with cards you don't even like or whatever. Like you can find ways to make that work. Like there's if again coming back to what is it? Coming back to like proliferate. There is a proliferate card that will draw you cards. I'm just finding it to display right now. Tezzeret's Gambit, right?
Tezzeret's Gambit.
So like this is a card draw spell, right? 3, and it's a Fire Exceed mana, and it's basically just divination. It draws you 2, but then you also proliferate. So like, whereas I might not be jazzed to run divination in a commander deck necessarily, I feel like for me personally, like unless it's a recurring instant and sorcery type spell, you're probably not getting so much value off of that. But Tezzeret's Gambit is something I would include in a deck that cared about proliferating, right? Like, yeah, it's pretty incremental value here. It's pretty small value rather. But I think overall it'd probably be worth it, right? So that's where I think like 10 isn't a hard number you need to hit. Although I gotta say, I have been most recently going back, looking at old decks that I've brewed and saying, why aren't these decks as successful as I'd like? And it's often because their mana is not good enough, and or I'm never drawing enough cards. So I've been kind of beefing up my card draw and ramp and fixing and making sure that I can play this game. I can actually play, and that's a very important thing to be able to do, because you can include all the synergy in the world if you want, but if you're not drawing enough lands and drawing enough cards, then you're not going to be able to keep up in a game of Commander. So those things are very important. Artifact and enchantment removal is very important. Graveyard hate is very important. But you do get this point where it's like, I got this critical mass of these utility cards that now I can't even include any of my synergy, right? So this is what we're talking about. This is why it's important to find the synergy on the cards that on these utility things and on these like must-haves that you it's better to be able to find the synergy there as well.
It's so true.
We could make a whole episode about the cards that we're talking about here right now too, right? Like Tezzeret's Gambit is probably the most obvious one when it comes to what we just were talking about, but there's a ton of other ones, and really good ones too.
Yeah, and the trouble with that kind of topic is that it becomes like, well, what if you're like specifically a green-white token deck? What are the staples that cover that? It's like, okay, great, but what if I'm a black-green token deck? Yeah. What are the new staples that do that? It's like the green ones are the same, but the black ones are different. So, I guess just kind of like reiterate the idea is like, if you're the type of person that always goes like, yeah, here's my 10 draw, here's my 10 ramp, here's my couple of wraths, here's my couple of counter spells, take a look at the ones you're using, right? I mean, obviously, I'm never going to tell you to cut a Cultivate. Cultivate's a very good card for a good reason. But like, just look a little deeper, see if there's some that maybe like ramps 5 through 10 can like be a little bit different. Maybe they can like synergize a bit better.
This is really our philosophy when it comes to Commander. You've got, there's the more competitive and spiky players and content creators out there. There's your the people who are all in on 75%, which is of course Jason Alt's like theory of brewing Commander decks at 75% strength. But even that, I find, which I love the idea of it, but I've now that I've played enough Commander with enough people from all over and going to GPs and things like that, that 75% is very subjective also. One person's 75% is not another person's 75%. Like my 75%, I'll tell you right now, is very different than Josh Lee Quiet's 75%. I promise you.
Yeah.
So that already kind of skews with how spiky you think Commander is or can be or could be or whatever. So, but if you just take a general approach of like synergy over functionality, I think you're going to find yourself building slightly lower power level decks and the benefit is that you'll have more fun with them, I think. And as a group, we're talking about like home metas too. Like if you went and played at a store, you're going to get people of all different deck construction. So it's harder to talk about there.
You know what? I think you make a great point. I hadn't thought of it that way. The 75% rule is a great rule to kind of keep things but it has always been a little bit abstract to me. I never know what that means, but I think you kind of nailed it, Andy. We didn't figure this out until we were just chatting here, but like I think that's brilliant, Andy. The more synergistic you are, as opposed to the more stable you are, the more in line with the 75% you probably are.
Yeah, totally. I think so.
I love it.
True 75%. Although if you talk to Jason, his 75% is even different than what I assumed his 75% was. Like it's definitely more powerful than I thought even he was talking about. So, yeah, and you can read lots of Jason Alt's articles all over the place about 75% and all his kind of stuff. So go check that out.
Cool.
Great.
Big thanks to all our patrons who make these episodes possible.
Yeah, and if you want to check out more comedy videos, check out our Brews News playlist.
Make sure you follow us on Twitch TV to see when we play live.
If you want to chat with us, head over to Twitter. We're at Commanders Brew.
And please hit subscribe to ding the bell and find out when we got new stuff coming out.
See you next time.
Bye.